The wind, a sharpened blade, scoured the skeletal trees that clawed at the slate-gray sky. Alara had long ceased to feel the cold, her body a frozen shell propelled forward by a will that was pure, desperate instinct. Snow, fine as dust, whispered across the barren earth, clinging to the threadbare shawl that barely covered the three bundled shapes clutched against her chest. Each breath was a shallow, painful gasp, each step a testament to a strength she hadn't known she possessed, born only of an unimaginable terror. Her husband, Thomas, had left with the last of their meager savings and a promise to return with supplies, a promise that had withered and died with the first frost. That had been 2 months ago. Now only the relentless, gnawing hunger and the faint, fragile cries of her triplets remained. She'd heard whispers of a solitary man, Elias Thorne, who lived beyond the last, skeletal outpost of what passed for civilization. A man of few words, they said, a man who kept to himself. Desperation was a relentless cart, dragging her onward, away from the empty, freezing cabin where silence had become a predator. Her vision blurred, not just from the biting wind, but from the unshed tears that had long since dried into a perpetual ache behind her eyes. Her feet, numb and cracked, stumbled over unseen roots and frozen clumps of earth. One more step, always just one more step. Then, through the swirling white veil, a dark shape solidified a barn, squat and weathered, its heavy timbers hunched against the elements like a sleeping beast. A wisp of smoke, a living thing, curled from a stone chimney nearby, a promise of warmth that beckoned with an almost unbearable tenderness. Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, flickered within her. But it was a hope too late. The last of her strength, a finite resource she had drawn upon for too long, finally gave way. The world tilted. The cold ground rushed up to meet her, a blackness blooming at the edges of her sight. Her arms, even in collapse, instinctively tightened around the 3 precious bundles, protecting them from the fall. A faint whimper, then another, pierced the rising darkness. Through the haze, a shadow detached itself from the barn's open doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the dim interior light. A man, Elias Thorne. He stood for a moment, unmoving, a statue carved from the harsh landscape. She could not discern his features, only the dark, unreadable presence. Her body hit the frozen earth with a dull thud, the impact jarring through her bones, but her grip remained. Her head swam, consciousness slipping like sand through a sieve. The cold, once her tormentor, now seemed to embrace her, a final, numbing solace. He took a slow breath, the vapor pluming in the frigid air. His gaze, unreadable in the deepening twilight, swept from the slumped figure on the ground to the small, bundled forms clutched so tightly. A pause stretched, taut and silent, between them and the howling wind. Then, with a deliberate, almost ritualistic motion, he reached up, his gloved hand rising to the brim of his wide-brimmed hat. He pushed it back, just slightly, revealing a hint of the weathered face beneath. His voice, when it came, was low, raspy, carrying just above the wind's mournful song. Not a question, not an offer, but a simple, resonant command that cut through the encroaching darkness. Come inside, and then the world went black. Alara drifted back to consciousness on a wave of warmth, a sensation so alien it took a moment to register. The persistent ache in her bones was still there, a dull throb, but the searing cold was gone, replaced by a gentle heat that permeated her limbs. Her eyes fluttered open, slowly adjusting to the dim, golden light of a single lantern. She lay on a narrow cot, a rough wool blanket covering her, the scratchy fabric a strange luxury. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, a faint, clean scent of earth and honest labor. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the drowsy warmth. The babies! She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips as her muscles protested fiercely. A figure moved into her periphery, a large, silent presence. Elias Thorne. He sat on a low stool by a crackling fireplace, his back to her, methodically cleaning what appeared to be a hunting rifle. He hadn't spoken, hadn't looked at her, yet his stillness spoke volumes. Her gaze darted, desperately searching. And then she saw them. 3 small, swaddled bundles nestled in a large wooden crate near the hearth, warmed by the fire's glow. Each distinct cry, now muted, had been replaced by the soft, rhythmic sounds of breathing. She could just make out tiny fists, a wispy tuft of dark hair. Relief, so profound it was almost dizzying, washed over her, weakening her already fragile hold. Her eyes welled, blurring the outlines of the room. She swallowed hard, forcing the emotion down. She couldn't afford weakness, not now. Elias, without turning, seemed to sense her awakening. A chipped tin cup appeared on a small, crude table beside her cot, steaming faintly. He had placed it there silently, without a word, before resuming his task. Alara reached for it, her hand trembling. The liquid was broth, thin but fortifying, tasting of root vegetables and game. Each swallow was an act of pure survival, a lifeline. She studied him cautiously as she drank. He was formidable, his shoulders broad beneath a worn canvas jacket, his hands calloused and strong. His face, when he finally turned slightly to stoke the fire, was etched with lines. His eyes a pale, startling blue that seemed to take in everything without betraying a single thought. He was not unkind, but he was certainly not welcoming in the traditional sense. His hospitality was a matter of grim necessity, a simple acknowledgement of life's raw demands. Days bled into a rhythm of quiet survival. Alara discovered he had found a small, rusted tin of powdered milk, left over from some long-forgotten supply, and had been feeding the babies with careful, measured spoonfuls. He never held them, never cooed, but his actions spoke of a strange, almost clinical competence. He moved through his tasks, chopping wood, mending tools, tending to a single cow in the barn, with an economy of motion that bespoke years of solitary living. She, in turn, began to help. Her strength slowly returned, enough to knead dough for simple bread, to mend his torn shirts with thread she'd found in an old sewing kit he possessed. Their conversations were minimal, often limited to practical matters. The weather, the dwindling store of potatoes, the baby's hunger. Yet, in the shared silence, a fragile understanding began to bloom. He saw her competence, her quiet determination, and she saw past his stoic facade to the quiet, unyielding integrity beneath. The barn, once a symbol of her collapse, now held a tentative, almost sacred peace. But the winter was long, and the future remained a vast, frightening unknown. How long could this unspoken arrangement last? The delicate equilibrium they had found was as fragile as ice on a spring puddle. It shattered with the first cough. Elias was out, checking his traps, when it began. Little Iris, the smallest of the triplets, had been fussing more than usual. A tiny, fretful sound that Alara had attributed to hunger or a wet cloth. But then came the cough, wet and rattling, quickly followed by a feverish flush that crept across her tiny face. Alara's heart seized in her chest, a cold dread replacing the fragile warmth she had cultivated. She had already lost so much. The thought of losing one of her children, after all she had endured, was unbearable. She paced the small living space, cradling Iris, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead, murmuring desperate lullabies. The other two, healthy for now, watched from their crate, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. When Elias returned, his face was dusted with snow, his arms laden with firewood. He paused just inside the doorway, sensing the shift in the air, the palpable tension that hummed in the small room. His gaze went straight to Alara, then to the whimpering bundle in her arms. "She's burning up," Alara choked out, her voice raw with fear. "I don't know what to do. There's no doctor for days, even if I could get there." Elias shed his coat, his movements precise despite the urgency. He knelt beside her, his large hand, surprisingly gentle, resting on Iris's forehead. His brow furrowed, a rare display of concern. "Lung fever," he stated, his voice quiet, devoid of panic. Seen it before. There's a root for a poultice. Helps with the breathing. He moved with a sudden, purposeful energy, rummaging through a wooden box filled with dried herbs and strange-smelling tinctures. Alara watched him, a sliver of desperate hope piercing through her terror. He seemed to know what he was doing. He crushed a dark, fibrous root with a pestle, mixing it with hot water. His movements deliberate and unhurried even as Iris's breathing grew more labored. He showed Alara how to apply the warm, pungent poultice to the baby's chest, his instructions brief but clear. Hours bled into a nightmarish vigil. Alara sat by the hearth, Iris pressed to her, Elias occasionally adding wood to the fire, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling storm of her fear. There was no more talk of guests or temporary arrangements. They were simply two souls united in the fight for a tiny life. Just as the first faint hint of dawn touched the horizon, a new sound pierced the silence, the heavy thud of hooves, followed by voices, rough and insistent. Elias stiffened, his hand going to the rifle he had cleaned days ago, now propped by the door. "Stay here," he rumbled, his eyes meeting hers, a warning in their pale depths. Alara's breath hitched. She had recognized the voices. Men from the next valley, men who had known Thomas, men who rarely brought good news. They had come for something or someone, her, perhaps, or even Elias. The outside world, with all its cruelties and judgments, had finally found them. This wasn't just about Iris anymore. This was about their fragile sanctuary, their very right to exist. Elias stood by the door, a silhouette of quiet menace, ready to face whatever, or whoever, stood on the other side. The soft whimpering of Iris, still feverish, was the only sound in the tense stillness of the barn. The confrontation was brief, brutal, and utterly in character for Elias. The men, two burly figures reeking of cheap liquor and ill intent, had demanded entry, claiming they were looking for a runaway horse, their eyes already raking over the barn with unsettling curiosity. Elias had met their aggression with a stillness more potent than any shout. His rifle, held loosely but purposefully, was a silent extension of his will. His voice, when he spoke, was low, calm, yet each word carried the weight of stone. "There's nothing here for you. Turn back." There was no bravado, only an unyielding resolve that, coupled with the glint of steel, seemed to finally deter them. With muttered curses and a final, lingering sneer at the man who clearly wasn't to be trifled with, they retreated, their heavy footsteps fading into the snowy morning. Alara, clutching Iris, had watched from the shadows, a silent witness to Elias's quiet ferocity. A primal wave of gratitude, fierce and overwhelming, washed over her. He had protected them, not just the physical space, but the fragile, blossoming hope within it. The immediate threat gone, her focus returned to Iris. The poultice, combined with Elias's steady, wordless presence, had worked. Slowly, agonizingly, Iris's fever began to break. Her small body, once burning, grew cooler, and her breathing, though still shallow, became less ragged. By the following afternoon, she was nursing weakly, her tiny grip on Alara's finger a miracle of resilience. The crisis had passed, leaving behind a profound exhaustion, but also a quiet, unshakable certainty. Alara looked at Elias across the hearth, where he sat, once more cleaning the rifle, its purpose now understood. He hadn't asked for thanks, nor did she offer effusive words. Their understanding had deepened beyond the need for them. She saw him not as the gruff recluse, but as the quiet protector, the man who had, without question or complaint, offered shelter and sustenance when the world had offered only abandonment. And he, perhaps, saw in her more than just a helpless woman and her burden, but a spirit as unyielding as the land itself. The winter's grip began to loosen in the weeks that followed, the days stretching, the sun casting longer, gentler light. The barn, once a temporary refuge, had become something akin to a home, built not of timber and stone, but of unspoken trust and shared purpose. Alara found her own strength growing, not just physically, but in a quiet, inner resolve. She no longer saw herself as broken, but as tempered. The grief for Thomas, and for the life she had lost, still lingered like a distant echo, but it no longer consumed her. Her focus was on the vibrant, demanding lives of her 3 children, and the quiet partnership that had unexpectedly bloomed in the most unlikely of places. She learned to track with Elias, to recognize the subtle signs of changing weather, to gather wild herbs for remedies. He, in turn, learned the rhythms of the baby's needs, his pale eyes softening imperceptibly when one of them grasped his finger. Their lives were interwoven now, a tapestry of quiet effort and mutual respect. The future remained unwritten, sprawling and wild like the land around them, but they faced it together, not as a man and a woman in the way of stories, but as 2 resilient souls forged in hardship, standing shoulder to shoulder, building a future born of necessity, hope, and the quiet, unwavering promise of a new dawn. The faint cries of the triplets, once sounds of despair, now simply underscored the quiet rhythm of their enduring lives.